Well, hello again, and welcome to another episode of TIO Talks. My name is Warwick Powell, and I'm your host. Today, I'm joined by Zhou. Zhou is a former or retired senior colonel with the Chinese People's Liberation Army, and is now a senior fellow at at Tsinghua University Center for International Security and Strategy. We're going to talk a lot about the emergence of China and how it is that we can better understand what this emergence means to regional and global security and prosperity. Welcome to the show, Zhou. It's great to see you.
Thank you, Warwick. Good evening from Beijing.
Yeah, fantastic. Look, I guess I wanted to focus this discussion really around a book that you recently published, which is called Should the World Be Afraid of China? I think it's an incredibly provocative question, but I guess the point is that it aims to ask some serious questions and help people navigate not just the issues at stake, but how we even think about the issues. One of the points that you make in your book is that the rise of China has given rise to a range of Western anxieties. And those Western anxieties perhaps have less to do with China's rise per se, and a lot more to do with change in general, but the relative reduction or the diminution of Western power and authority itself, which may actually be a greater source of anxiety than anything else. Perhaps you could just share with us some of your perspectives on that question of China's rise and the West's relative position and how that affects the way that the Western world in particular is thinking about this question of China and what it means for the future of global security and prosperity.
Yeah, thank you, Warwick. I think this is a good question. Actually, the title of my book, Should the World Fear China, is the first direct question asked to me by a German magazine called Die Zeit. And actually, I was criticized by a few Chinese for having this title because they believe that how could we say that should the world fear China or not? If you say should the West fear China or not, that seems to be more appropriate. That is an interesting argument because apart from the West, look at the Southeast Asia. So they have mixed feeling towards China, in which there is also an element of fear, right? So maybe if you talk about Africa or Latin America, these countries far away from China should not have much, fear of China. But coming back to your question, I think because the whole world actually has been used Western narrative, for a long, long time, which is because the temporal history, human history is dominated by the Western world. So Americans, pride or hubris actually started to develop after it wins the war over Spain, right? That was the end of the 19th century. So then gradually, but surely, it came to the apogee of the world power. So even some leading American scholars have said that if he would have to see, the United States become number two in the world, he himself find it difficult to accept. I understand. Yeah. So this kind of mentality, which is difficult to change, but it has to be changed because even in the West, people have realized how the world has changed. I attended quite a few Munich Security Conference, and I believe a couple of years ago, the theme of the conference is simply one word: Westernless less. Yeah, Westernless, Westernless less. That and the conclusion is not only is the world become less Western, but the world itself is become less Western. And in the Munich Security Conference this year, the title has changed into multipolarization. So that means even in the one of the leading Western country, people have realized that the world is becoming multipolar world, but the direction, of course, is absolutely clear. Although this world has yet to take its full, clear shape. I think that's where we're standing. Even Rubio talked about how the unipolar, being a unipolar power is not normal. Yeah. So this is very interesting. Yeah.
I mean, speaking of Rubio, I mean, he made those remarks in the early days of the new Trump administration, and at about the same time, China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi also gave a talk at Munich. But it seemed to me that there were two very different views of what multipolarity might entail. Rubio tended to, it seemed to me anyway, or my interpretation at the time was one that was much more around great power competition and perhaps even heading towards the idea of spheres of influence. Whereas Wang Yi's idea was a lot more inclusive, so to speak, and did not have any notions of spheres of influence at all. Could you perhaps share some reflections on what Rubio might have meant by that, and perhaps contrast that with Wang Yi's perspective, if there are in fact some differences in how these two approaches are trying to tackle this question?
Well, there are so many allegations coming from West that China wants to, reshape the international order, so on and so forth. I wrote an essay, short op-ed that was published in Financial Times. When it, came out, to my great surprise, I found that the title is exactly the opposite of what I tried to say. Is the title just China is reshaping the international order, something like that. So that is a very, very big surprise to me. I was even afraid, how my boss would read this. Yeah, to say, I have written such an article, but anyway, they have read it, so they will not blame me. Yeah, the point is that in the West, they do believe that China is trying to shape the international order. I don't think so. Yeah, because China is apparently the beneficiary, the largest beneficiary of the international order, which is rooted in the rules and regimes that are indeed made by the West. The international order, in my argument, is never a kind of a liberal international order, but the rules and regime after the Second World War are really made by the West. Yeah, and China has benefited more than anyone from such a kind of system. So China's attitude toward the international order is somewhat different from Russia's. Russia resents this order. Yeah, in President Putin's very word, he said, "Oh, what is the use of the world without Russia?" And in my op-ed that was published, yeah, in FT, in another op-ed, I said, "Okay, then where is then where is Russia without the world, right?" So you can almost argue in another way, but China is beneficiary, while Russia believes it is a victim. So although we all called for multipolarity, so we have to be careful. This kind of word sounds politically correct because it's just like cooperation sounds more beautiful than competition, but we have to be very much careful about the subtlety. So in fact, I believe when China and India talk about multipolarity, they basically mean the same thing. But even in this case, yeah, India want to distance itself from China, especially a few years ago because of what happened in Galvan Valley, 4 years ago when the Chinese and Indian soldiers had deadly brawl. So they try to distance itself from China, and such kind of a difference in interpretation of multipolarity, as I said, between China and India is a difference between two apples. It's not a difference between one apple and one pear, by which I basically mean our attitudes, towards multipolarity, even towards the war in Ukraine, are more or less the same.
What about Rubio's view, though? People latched onto his comment that unipolarity is an historical exception. What do you think is the emerging view, at least in Rubio's eyes, as to what he thinks this non-unipolar world means? Because I again, what he says is different to what I think China means and what Russia means and what India means.
Yeah, I think he has come to admit that the world order has changed. Well, we don't need to worry too much about Donald Trump's worldview because he basically is a businessman. He's transactional, but his new tenants might have some of their own ideas. So yes, they would believe that the international order is no longer unipolar. Yeah, but still they want to maintain the dominant position. Yeah, in this multi-polar world, and that is the problem. Yeah, that is why we're having all this problem. I think if you look at how the United States has changed its policy, basically, it depends on where you are talking about. If we're talking about this region, basically the policies start to change a little bit, starting with President Obama, right, with the pivot to Asia, so on and so forth. But now it's completely changed. Yeah. So the question is how we could coexist. I believe Americans, attitude uh, has a breaking point because in the past it had a kind of empty hope for China to change, yeah, to become like America. Yeah, Vice President Michael Pence talked about it, yeah, at the Hudson Institute. But the point is, China never lied to United States. China never said we want to become like you, right? In fact, China always stand firm, yeah, to say we want to maintain our socialist system. China is worried about the so-called peaceful evolution. So China has never lied to the United States. So United States, seeing China becoming, you know, is much stronger, yet still different, start to panic. Yeah. And then during Trump's first administration, so this kind of feeling eventually start to explode to describe us as a strategic competitor. So I believe right now it's a good thing that the United States has come to realize that the world is no longer unipolar. That means actually they have admitted that the United States has really declined. Yeah, the only question is to what extent, right? So I think it will take probably another 10 to 20 years for the United States to come down to realize, okay, this time they have a peer competitor. Yeah, but this peer competitor is not Soviet Union, and with some other countries also becoming much stronger, much stronger. Yeah.
So the recognition that unipolarity is over is, if I'm getting your assessment right, actually a really important first step for the United States, broadly speaking, and I guess the collective West, to ultimately begin a journey to face reality.
Yes.
So there is an acceptance that the old world is no longer what it was, but
Mm.
nonetheless, even as a more multipolar, multinodal, or whatever it is world emerges, the strategic objective of the United States, nonetheless, is to seek to preserve its dominance and primacy. Nonetheless, would that be fair to say?
Yes, that is absolutely correct. Except that there is one thing that the United States would not admit openly. That is the decline of America's own strength. Yeah.
Yeah, you touch on that in your book, actually, that part of the anxiety is not just about China's rise, but it's actually the mirror of China's rise, and that is the internal decline of the
Yeah.
United States economically and
Mm.
militarily, and arguably, I guess, also in terms of a cultural, ideological leadership of the world as well. You know, the idea of the America shining light on a hill, the dominance that it had over the cultural landscape of the world and the information world. Perhaps
Mm.
you could just go into that dimension a little bit more. That that the situation we find ourselves in is perhaps a little bit more to do with the decline of the West, if you will, rather than with the rise of China per se.
Well, I think Warwick, actually, you made a very good point. I just read what you have published in Guancha Chinese website, in which you talk about how American industrial bases actually is no longer in the United States, right? So it becomes hollow, yeah. So that is why all this kind of American strength is declining, because you are not standing firmly on the soil, right? You are standing probably on some other people's soil. So how could hopefully win in the competition? So in this regard, I think the conclusion is, well, if you have to rely on other countries, yeah, for different stuff in a multi-polarized world, in a global world. So the best way, of course, is for you to cooperate with these countries who also want to cooperate with you, to make sure about the international supply chain, so on and so forth, yeah, to be still intact. I think it is very ironic that the United States would describe China as revisionist. I talked to some Americans yesterday, and I said, well, okay, no revisionist is bigger than the United States, and they agree, right? So I sometimes wonder whether Donald Trump's voter would have thought that he would want to, annex Canada, Greenland. These things are actually simply unimaginable, right?
Yeah, you actually mention in your book again and in some of your other writings this idea of this misconception that in fact China is a revisionist power in a capital R sense, that it's seeking to overturn the order. I mean, you mentioned earlier that China, in fact, has been a beneficiary of the post-war order. But having said that, China is not a status quo power either. It does seek to insert some perspectives into the order. It seeks to advocate for some reforms and fine-tuning, if you will, in ways that perhaps reflect its own rise, but also its own experiences as a developing country. Do you think that China's own strategic vision to prosecute a case of reform is also causing anxieties in the West, even while the United States is the greatest revisionist power at the moment? I mean, these are the sort of paradoxes that I think seem to be part and parcel of our current moment.
Yeah, yes, I do understand this, because no matter how you talk about your peaceful intention, but the fact is you are growing with strength, you are become bigger. So this kind of strength could be awesome or intimidating, to some other people. Yeah. So your own strength would bring changes. That is for sure, to the environment around you, or even to the international order, given China's huge heft. Yeah. So sometimes I also wonder, what is China? Yeah, as I have written in the introduction of my book, because China certainly is a developing country if its economy is divided by its population. But on the other hand, it is also the largest exporter, yeah, largest trading nation, largest industrial nation, and largest country with the largest foreign currency reserve. These are all true. So if, for example, in 10 years' time, China could surpass the United States to become the largest economy in the world, yeah, it could, the largest economy in the world, be a developing country, right? So if it is a developing country, then what's the point of dividing countries into developed country and the developing country? So you can see how China's growth would just challenge all these deep-rooted concepts. Yeah, but on the other hand, China has said repeatedly that it only meant to improve the international order. And in the past, even China would talk directly that it is a guardian of the international order. So when we talk about improvement, that means China doesn't want to overthrow this system. Yeah, of course, there is always room for improvements anywhere, right? So then we have to talk about the four global initiatives by President Xi, right? Sometimes I was asked by some foreigners, if you want to safeguard international order, if you believe the international order in your eye is not that different from our order, yeah. So why would you put forward these global initiatives anyway? Right? So there is a point in this, but I thought for a moment and I conclude that still are we talking about the same thing? Yes and no. Yes, of course, we're talking about the same order. No, because right now this order is really being undermined, yeah, by the United States, yeah, by the Western countries, yeah, and through the war in Ukraine. So even if we try to emphasize, yeah, the same old rules, yeah, say in UN Charter, yeah, from Chinese perspective, I think because China is a rising power, so therefore it is still significant, yeah, for us to mention this, to stress on the importance of these rules, of these principles found in UN Charter. Yeah, we talk about them because we do not want them to be challenged.
There's other parts of the fabric, if you will, of the international law regime that has evolved over the last 70 years that China's also a great defender of. And I'm speaking, of course, about some of the resolutions at the United Nations concerning the status of People's Republic of China as the only representative of China, and the question of the island of Taiwan. In an interview that I saw that you gave some months ago, you were asked about China's military strength that's been developing and the exercises that it performs, and you asked the question, why is China doing this? And you gave a very candid response, which was something along the lines, and I'm going to paraphrase you, so forgive me if I'm a little bit incorrect, but something along the lines of, you practice because you might have to do war, and that's why you practice. Perhaps you could shed a little bit of light again on how China or Chinese policy thinkers and strategic thinkers are thinking about this question of China's own strength in the region, and how that is, I guess, impacting on the dynamics of the region. Because where I'm trying to get to, I guess, is partly about China's military emergence as a source of both strength for China, but a source of anxiety for others. And then have a look at what that means for the neighbors within the region, less the United States and a lot more about the neighbors.
Okay, you say China is a unique major power in that it has the common tasks as everyone has, that is a territorial defense, that is about sovereignty issue, right? In this regard, China is still not a country really unified because Taiwan is still separated. But at the same time, China, like other major powers, has two things more. One is it's ever increasing overseas interests, which is ubiquitous around the world, and then its international responsibilities that is associated with a major power. So China actually has three tasks at the same time, which makes China so unique, I would say. Once I was asked by a Danish journalist who also read my book. She asked me the question. He said, your book is called "Should the World Fear China?" If you people look at the parade of Tiananmen Square, shouldn't people be afraid of China, right? To see your strengths. But I say, well, these are two different things. One is, of course, you have to be strong. But the second thing is, even if you are strong, you don't have to use force. And China's history in the past 4 decades and more tells that China's rise is indeed peaceful. And in fact, in human history, you can hardly see a country rising so peacefully. So that actually give me a hope of whether China could still have a peaceful rise. Yeah. So if what we have achieved is a kind of miracle in human history, that is China's peaceful rise, could we continue, yeah, to prove that even if you are strong, you don't have to be a hegemon? Yeah, that is another challenge. Yeah, if China could, reunify with Taiwan peacefully, I would say that would be to everybody's, including my own relief. Yeah, and is it possible? I believe it is still possible for two reasons. One is the time is on our side. The second thing is Taiwan would not move away, right? Because given what Taiwanese leader William Lai's remarks about himself being a pragmatic Taiwanese leader, or the Chinese mainland is a hostile foreign force, in theory, we could use force even now. Yeah, we could take that as kind of a declaration of independence. But the Chinese government is still having patience. We're still talking about peaceful reunification. Yeah. So you see, when China becomes stronger on the Taiwan issue, there could be two different roads, yeah, leading to different direction. One is you become more confident because you are stronger. The second is you become more impatient because you are stronger, right? So I think right now the Chinese government is still patient, but all these remarks coming from Taiwan actually would make our patience running a little bit thinner than before, I would say. So people talk about a status quo. That is kind of human nature because people are afraid of sudden drastic changes, especially changes caused by the war. We understand no status quo is static. Yeah, the status quo actually is changing every day. After Nancy Pelosi's visit, yeah, across the strait, for example, there is no longer the so-called medium line. Yeah, so long as the Taiwanese leader keep on making this kind of remarks, I believe he will just feel more and more pressure. Therefore, I actually thought about how the United States could actually play a positive role in this regard. Yeah. So Donald Trump is having, unprecedented authority. Yeah, yeah, within his own party, and so in this regard, even if he does something to change, the cross-strait relationship, uh, therefore, I don't believe he would have a lot of obstacles. Why I talk about that? Because when was the former Taiwanese leader Chen Shui-bian, yeah, tried to uh, ask for a referendum, President Bush called him a troublemaker. Remember, right? So that kind of attitude actually is very much clear. Yeah. So this kind of activities, yeah, are not to be encouraged. Yeah. So China also wants peace across the strait, and because the Chinese military is growing with strength, so actually the U.S. military is not having enough confidence, yeah, to fight against China at our doorstep. So in this regard, why don't you just ask the Taiwanese authority to calm down, yeah, to be less provocative? That serves everybody's interest, I would say.
The other countries in the region, of course, are also affected by China's rise. Many of them are deeply connected to China economically. But there is a patchwork of attitudes, if you will, from Japan, Korea, Philippines, all the way through to Malaysia, Indonesia, Vietnam, and the China's neighbors on this side of the world. And by that I mean the Asia side, if you will, or the Pacific side. Perhaps you could just walk us through your general assessment of, you've touched on the Taiwan question, but I guess I'm interested in your assessment of the slightly wider regional questions about China's rise and how its near neighbors are responding to that, and what that may mean as the United States' own relative power in the region continues to diminish.
Well, I think, small countries, since time immemorial, have learned one thing, that is hedging. Yeah, yeah, because they are small, so they are born with this kind of a talent of hedging. Right now, all countries are hedging, including American allies, and the way of hedging is not to pick sides, but to pick sides with issues. Yeah, on this issue, I'm with America. On that issue, I'm with China. So you never know which side is really, taking. So that is the strategy. You see, about Southeast Asia, this is so clever of them. A bunch of small countries actually, uh, bind up together to look bigger, and they have even become attractive, to both China and the United States. And why do they have such kind of space? Because they are making use of the rivalry, yeah, among major powers. But this has to be a kind of a rivalry rather than conflict, because if there is a conflict, then they cannot make use of the situation. So what they would be afraid is that their so-called centrality would be actually uh, become a kind of central battlefield, yeah, which it would destroy their own homeland. So they're making best use of this kind of rivalry, yeah, among major power, and for Japan and Australia, actually they have refused, yeah, to answer this hypothetical question. If there is a conflict in Taiwan Strait, would they fight along American side? They refuse to answer this question. Of course, with good reasons, because Americans' own attitude is a kind of strategic ambiguity. Then why would I have to be so clear about my position, right? Yeah. So that would be very, very difficult decision for them to make. So I once read a report from Rand. Its conclusion is that, okay, it's simply impossible for us to know the real attitude of the Japanese government. Yeah, the Japanese government will only make decision upon the real situation there.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I mean, we've just spent, I guess, the last half an hour really talking about the questions of security and China's rise on planet Earth itself. But I know that you've also written a contribution recently on the question of security and warfare, I guess, in space. And perhaps I could just spend the last 5 or 10 minutes of this discussion picking your brains on that. I know very little about this particular area. And in the process of writing this piece, I know that you've absorbed an incredible amount of expert opinion. So could I just ask you, firstly, just to walk us through the article that you've written, or the chapter, and what some of your key arguments are, and what the issues are that you think matter, and some of the conceptual innovations that you've developed to help strategic thinkers and policymakers actually think hard about the questions of security in space?
Well, thank you for this question. Yeah, because it's true that fewer people would think about the security of outer space, and it's precisely because of this I have argued that it is no human folly is more monumental than placing weapons in outer space to strike back on planet, our own homeland. Yeah, if competition has to be there, why should it spill over above and to the outer space? Yeah, so China's attitude is basically like that of Russia, because we two countries have jointly table proposal that is no placement of a weapon whatsoever in orbit. Yeah, because I think that kind of attitude is so easy to be understood, because it came from the Outer Space Treaty. Yeah, that is no placement of weapon mass destruction in orbit. That is already agreed. So China and Russia's proposal is a step further, which I think it is quite clear. But because the Western countries, especially the United States, want to maintain a kind of dominance even in space. Yeah, So we are already seeing kind of a race of arms race in our space. So they say no, China's, Russia's proposals are not practical. So what we need to do instead is to have the so-called responsible behavior, right? So the argument is it is impossible for the roads not to have cars. So what we need to do is make sure about the rules for the traffic, yeah. Uh, but actually, China's proposal is, I would say, the most responsible one. Because if we do not have any weapons in outer space, why then we do not adopt some other rules? Yeah, so this is the most fundamental way of resolving this issue. As my own views are concerned, I have made a number of suggestions or conclusions. One is attack on one in space is attack on all, because we have satellites of different countries and all running on the same orbit. Yeah, for example, low orbits, right? So if you attack one satellite, China, China, India, United States, and Russia, these four countries have demonstrated a kind of capability, yeah, to target the satellites and destroy the satellites. So if you destroy one satellite, it will generate a lot of debris. It depends on how big your satellite is. Maybe it could be a few thousand debris. These, if it is say 3,000 debris flying high speed, yeah, in the same orbit, you can imagine, yeah, how many dangers they could create for all the satellites. So attack on one is attack on all, right? And then another concept is, I believe, a war in outer space is a part or is a prelude or part of a nuclear all-out nuclear war. Because if you have decided to attack the satellite of another country in outer space, that means you have really taken a deep breath and want to do something big, right? So it's not about collision of ships or aircraft in South China Sea. So it has to. It is already a global war. It is a star war. So definitely it's a nuclear war, right? So that is my second concept. My third concept is I have coined a term called a mutually assured vulnerability. What does that mean? During Cold War, we have a term called mutual vulnerability. Yeah, and we have mutually assured destruction, right? Mutually assured destruction, yeah, between the two superpower. But in outer space, because everybody is vulnerable, so with this mutually assured vulnerability, we have to be careful. We have to take care of each other's interest. We have to coexist. And this is even one area we might have cooperation. During the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union, being enemies, still had cooperation in two fields. One is the joint efforts in eradicating smallpox. The other is peaceful use of the outer space. Yeah. So even be found between two bitter enemies, why can't the China and the US cooperate? But for this to happen, the United States has to, lift its resolution, which was embodied in the so-called Wolf Amendment. Yeah, but the irony is because Chinese space industry is also developing very fast, China could even find out what is in the dark side of the moon, right? So the Americans want to find out, okay, from China, what is behind in the dark moon. So in this regard, actually, this kind of restriction coming from United States is handicapping Americans' own hands. Yeah. So we know if you are not strong enough, of course, the United States would not cooperate with you. But if we are become equally strong, then of course there is plenty of room for cooperation. The United States could have cooperation with Soviet Union during Cold War because at that time the level of space exploration of Soviet Union was also very strong. So that is why.
Look, we've covered a lot of territory, a lot of ground, and a lot of space. I guess if I could just ask you one question to round off this discussion, which has been incredibly illuminating, is to get your sense of what the next 12 months and perhaps 5 years may look like, given the changes that are happening in the world and the shifting balances of power and perspectives from the major powers and the smaller powers. What does multipolarity possibly look like over the next 5 years?
Okay, we're still in this process. This is very much like, the train has moved. Nobody knows where the train is heading for, but everybody's afraid of not being able to catch the train. So that is why we're seeing SEO and the BRICS becoming so popular, right? Yeah. For the United States, I believe the United States, at the end of Trump's second term, would lose a lot of its credibility. In fact, I have argued that the damage Trump has done to Americans' image and credibility is more than those damage done by all his predecessors combined. Yeah. So whoever comes next will have to clean the mess. But I believe there are indeed a lot of things that no matter how he tries, he simply just cannot make it perfect. So it's irreversible, I would say. But as I said before, this trend of multipolarity will continue to move, but probably it will be 10 to 20 years. Yeah. Until then, we will not be able to see clearly how another international order would look like.
So should the world be fearful of China?
No, absolutely not. Yeah, I think China would be a brand new global power. Yeah, that can bring a lot of fresh image and fresh ideas, or even fresh products because of China's next to none industrial capabilities. Yeah, so I hope as a Chinese that being a Chinese, I'm of course I'm proud of being a member of this oldest civilization. But at the same time, I do hope my country, can help other countries, and the Chinese people can really live in peace with people around the world. I myself have been educated in the West, so I know how people think differently about different things. But that is the beauty of life, short of war. So I think because of what China did in the last 4 decades and a half, it gives me hope. Yeah, China is a different global power. China would not be a hegemon.
Well, that's a great place to end this discussion, with a glimmer of hope and the prospects of a future in which there can be more peace and more prosperity. Thank you very much for coming on the show, Zhou Bo, and hopefully we'll have you back on again in the not too distant future.
Thank you, Warwick. Thank you for this wonderful conversation.
If you liked that video, please like, comment, and subscribe. It really helps the channel. If you'd like to see more from TIO, check out the Substack link. Or if you'd like to see more from me, check out my Substack in the description.